The most powerful criminal in American history survived everything. Assassination attempts, federal raids, gang wars. In the end, he was destroyed by two things: an accountant and a bacteria quietly eating his brain. They all thought they were untouchable. Al Capone threw parties for thousands and owned half of Chicago. John Gotti walked out of 3 federal trials a free man while the crowd outside cheered his name. Whitey Bulger ran Boston for 2 decades, and the FBI didn't just ignore him, they protected him. Salvatore Riina hid in plain sight for 23 years while ordering the murders of judges, politicians, and anyone who looked at him wrong. They built empires, they bought governments, they rewrote the rules of power in their own image, and every single one of them fell. Not because they were weak, not because they got unlucky, but because the same qualities that made them untouchable, the arrogance, the paranoia, the hunger, eventually turned against them like a weapon they forgot they were holding. This is how every mafia boss eventually fell. October 17th, 1931, a federal courtroom in Chicago. The judge reads the verdict. 22 counts of tax evasion, guilty on 5. 11 years in federal prison. Al Capone sits there in his $500 suit and says nothing. The most feared man in America, the man who owned judges, police captains, and the mayor's office, has just been destroyed by paperwork. Not a bullet, not a betrayal. A stack of financial records assembled by a quiet IRS agent named Frank Wilson, who spent 3 years in a windowless room tracing cash. To understand how absurd that is, you have to understand what Capone was before that moment. He was born in Brooklyn in 1899, the son of Italian immigrants. No inheritance, no connections, no plan. Just a kid from the streets who figured out faster than anyone else that prohibition wasn't a law. It was an opportunity. By the late 1920s, his operation pulled in an estimated $60 million a year, at a time when the average American worker made $1,500. He employed corrupt judges, owned police captains, had the mayor's office on speed dial. When he walked into a baseball game, 20,000 people stood up and gave a criminal a standing ovation. He smiled, waved, sat down like a king. He was untouchable, and he knew it. That was the mistake. Capone was so confident in his immunity that he never bothered to file a tax return. Not once. He paid for everything in cash. He owned nothing on paper. He thought invisibility was protection. But the IRS had been watching the whole time, and Wilson's quiet accounting work built a paper trail Capone didn't know existed. He entered Alcatraz the most powerful criminal in American history. Inside, the syphilis he'd carried for years, ignored, untreated, because men like Capone don't go to doctors, finally reached his brain. By the time he was released in 1939, he had the mental capacity of a 12-year-old. He couldn't remember names. He couldn't follow conversations. In his last years at his Palm Island mansion in Florida, he would sit by the water fishing for hours, sometimes turning to his nurse and asking when the boys from Chicago were coming to visit. They weren't coming. Most of them were dead or in prison. Capone just didn't know that anymore. He died in 1947 at 48 years old. Not in a hail of bullets, not betrayed by an enemy. In the end, the thing that killed him was the disease he'd ignored for decades, while he was too busy being untouchable to notice it was eating him alive. Let's start with Sammy Gravano. On the morning of November 13th, 1991, Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano sat across from federal prosecutors in a room he wasn't supposed to be in. He was the underboss of the Gambino crime family, the second most powerful mob figure in New York, and he was about to do the one thing the mob considers unforgivable. He wasn't doing it because he'd lost his nerve. Gravano had personally committed 19 murders. Nerve wasn't the problem. The problem was that he'd spent the previous night listening to recordings the FBI had played him, recordings of his best friend's voice, casually, almost cheerfully, throwing him under the bus in private conversations, blaming murders on Sammy to protect himself, treating his closest ally as a disposable asset. John Gotti had talked too much, and the man he'd talked about had just decided to talk back. To understand why that mattered, you have to understand what Gotti was before that morning. He threw block parties for the whole neighborhood. He paid for fireworks every 4th of July. Kids in Queens idolized him. 3 separate federal juries had looked at the evidence and said not guilty. The newspapers called him the Teflon Don because nothing stuck. He'd risen through the Gambino ranks until December 16, 1985, when he ordered the assassination of Paul Castellano, the sitting boss, shot outside Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan during the Christmas rush. Broad daylight, a declaration. Gotti stepped over the body and took the family. For 6 years, he was the most famous gangster in America. He gave interviews. He wore $2,000 suits. He held court in Little Italy while federal agents photographed him from vans across the street. 3 times the government came for him. 3 times he walked. He wasn't just beating the law, he was humiliating it. But Gotti had a problem: his mouth. He talked constantly about murders, about money, about business that should never be spoken aloud. And the man sitting across from him at most of those conversations was Gravano, his underboss, his closest ally, the man he'd trusted with everything, and privately betrayed on tape. Gravano gave prosecutors everything: 19 murders, a complete map of Gambino operations, and the recordings, hours of Gotti's own voice talking about bodies like they were business expenses. On April 2nd, 1992, John Gotti was convicted on all counts: life in prison without parole. Gotti died of throat cancer in a federal prison hospital in June 2002. He was 61. Gravano served 5 years, walked free, then was arrested again in Arizona for running an ecstasy ring. The man who destroyed John Gotti couldn't even stay out of trouble himself. The Teflon Don was brought down by the one thing no suit in the world can protect you from: the wrong friend. Here is something the FBI will never fully admit. For years, they didn't want to catch Whitey Bulger. They needed him. James Joseph Bulger Jr. grew up in a South Boston housing project in the 1940s. He was arrested for the first time at 14, did a stretch in Alcatraz for armed robbery. Prison didn't rehabilitate him, it educated him. By the 1970s, Bulger controlled the Winter Hill Gang, Boston's dominant Irish mob. Loan sharking, extortion, drug trafficking, murder, all of it running with operational precision. But Bulger had an advantage nobody in Boston's underworld knew about. He was an FBI informant. His handler, Special Agent John Connolly, had grown up idolizing Bulger on the same South Boston streets. The arrangement was simple. Bulger gave Connolly intelligence on the Italian Patriarca family, the FBI's main target. In return, Connolly handed Bulger the names of informants inside his own organization. Those informants disappeared. Bulger didn't just use the FBI as a shield, he used it as a weapon. For years, nobody above Connolly looked closely enough to see what was happening. The Boston FBI office had become, functionally, an extension of Bulger's operation. By the mid-1990s, a new investigation, untainted by Connolly's corruption, began closing in. In January 1995, Bulger was tipped off one last time that an indictment was coming. He vanished. He was 65 years old, a grandfather's face, and completely off the grid. The FBI put him on their 10 most wanted list. He spent 16 years moving between cities with his girlfriend, Catherine Gregg, living under fake names, paying cash for everything. They found him in June 2011, Santa Monica, California, apartment 303. He was 81 years old, living under the name Charlie Gasco, with $800,000 in cash hidden inside the walls. A tip from a woman who recognized Catherine's face from an FBI awareness campaign brought them there. Not detective work, a television ad. He was convicted of 11 murders in 2013, transferred to a federal penitentiary in West Virginia in October 2018. Within hours of his arrival, inmates beat him to death with a padlock stuffed inside a sock. They gouged his eyes. The mob found him in the one place the FBI couldn't protect him anymore. Forget everything you think you know about how a fugitive hides. Salvatore Riina, the most wanted man in Italy, sentenced to life in absentia multiple times, responsible for hundreds of murders, spent 23 years hiding in the middle of Palermo. Not in the mountains, not abroad, in the city, in an apartment, with a wife, 4 children, and neighbors who knew him as Signor To, a quiet man, kept to himself. For 2 decades, that worked. Then he decided it wasn't enough. He wanted more. Riina was born in 1930 in Corleone, the town that would give its name to the most feared strain of the Sicilian Mafia. He committed his first murder at 19. By the 1980s, he had done what no one thought possible: unified Cosa Nostra under a single authority through a campaign of internal slaughter so extreme it became known as the Matanza. Hundreds of rival bosses eliminated, the entire structure of the Sicilian Mafia rebuilt from the ground up, with Riina at the top. He could have stayed invisible. He chose not to. In 1982, he ordered the assassination of General Carlo Alberto della Chiesa, the man who had dismantled the Red Brigades. Then, in 1992, he made the decision that ended everything. May 23rd, a massive bomb detonated under a highway near Capaci. Judge Giovanni Falcone, the architect of Italy's entire legal war against the Mafia, was killed along with his wife and 3 bodyguards. 2 months later, Falcone's closest colleague, Judge Paolo Borsellino, was killed by a car bomb outside his mother's apartment in Palermo. Italy didn't just grieve, it mobilized. Resources poured into Sicily like never before. Informants who had maintained omerta for decades started talking. The code of silence that had protected Cosa Nostra for generations cracked under the weight of what Riina had done. On January 15, 1993, less than 8 months after Falcone's murder, police stopped a car on a Palermo street. The man inside had been living 200 meters from where they had searched for him for years. Riina was arrested without resistance. He was 62 years old. He died in prison in 2017. Multiple life sentences, never cooperated, never broke. But his silence didn't save anything. His war against the Italian state didn't break the government. It broke Cosa Nostra. The era of the Sicilian Mafia's untouchability ended not because the state got stronger, but because Riina couldn't stop pushing until he gave them no other choice. He didn't lose because Italy defeated him. He lost because he made defeat inevitable. Here's what every one of these men had in common. None of them were beaten by someone stronger. Capone wasn't outmuscled, he was outpapered. Gotti wasn't outgunned, he was outtalked by his own voice on a recording. Bulger wasn't caught by brilliant detective work, someone recognized a face on television. Riina wasn't infiltrated, he simply pushed the Italian state past the point where it could afford to look the other way. They each had a single blind spot, and they each spent years walking straight toward it while looking in the other direction. Capone thought power was invisibility. Gotti thought loyalty was permanent. Bulger thought the FBI would protect him forever. Riina thought violence had no ceiling. The empire doesn't fall from the outside. It always collapses from within, from the one assumption the boss made so early, so deep, that he stopped questioning it entirely. Every mafia boss who ever sat at the top of that structure believed, at some level, that he had finally figured out the system that defeated everyone before him. None of them had. They just hadn't failed yet.